America was basically selling us a vision of ruins, a planet of ruins. And that's consistent with what it's done in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and of course, most spectacularly in Gaza with the genocide. But with Pakistan, they did something similar. So this is basically death and destruction that the US was offering. And on the other side, you had China coming in with all this kind of hopeful narrative of development, of progress, of investments in energy sector, in transport, in connectivity. So it was a very, very different experience.
Hello, and welcome to Global Majority for Peace. I'm Ileana Chan, and every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube and the full episode on Patreon for members to watch in full, but it is free. We have been accused of being capitalist for doing this, but it's actually just free. We're just trying to diversify the platforms just in case anything happens to this channel. So please become a member of Patreon. And if you do want to donate, just know that any donations go to really just to recoup our losses. No one's really making any money from this. So feel free to, to donate and know that it's not a capitalist project. Although, communism isn't about losing money, which is good because we're actually very pleased that we might even be talking about some communist, socialist ideas later in this podcast, because we have on Global Majority for Peace, Ammar Ali Jan, a Pakistani political activist and academic. He is a founder and general secretary of HKP, People's Rights Party, and also a member of Progressive International. Welcome, Ammar.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming on and joining us. So we like to begin each interview on a personal note. Could we start with you telling us about the origin of your politicization? If you can think of a particular incident that has led you to your worldview, that's always amazing, but most people can't.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's been so long now. But I grew up in a family that had a memory of politics because my father and actually both my parents were anti-dictatorship, democracy activists in the 1980s when we had a US-backed military dictator called General Zia-ul-Haq. He was the closest we've had to General Pinochet because he overthrew a left-wing prime minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was a socialist, and then hanged him in 1979. And this was the guy who was the architect of the Afghan jihad, that counter-revolution against the socialist government in Afghanistan, which was fueled by US and Saudi dollars, which eventually led to the formation of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all these nice folks who eventually ended up attacking the very West that funded them. But 90s is when I was growing up, and this was a time when there was depoliticization in society. So even my father would not talk much about politics because he felt his dreams had been betrayed. Most of the social democratic parties basically jumped the boat and eventually joined neoliberal politics. And all those aspirations of the 80s were repressed. And what brought politics back to Pakistan in a big way, I feel, was 9/11. And that is when a lot of young people were forced to think about politics because Pakistan became the frontline state in the US-led war in Afghanistan. Of course, everybody had strong opinions for or against the US, for or against even bin Laden. He was both popular and hated at that time, a polarizing figure. And then we saw how that war tore apart Pakistan. I remember bomb blasts in my city, Lahore, which is the very center of Pakistan. In the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan provinces, there were military operations that displaced hundreds of people. There were drone strikes that George Bush started, and then Obama, the liberal champion of human rights, escalated them. And these drone strikes were killing school children. These drone strikes were killing mourners at funerals or people who were attending weddings. So all of this was the background in which we started thinking about politics. This was very much about empire, extremism, war, violence. That was shaping our thinking. And then I started studying in the US. And I was very moved by two things. One was the immigrants' rights movement in 2006, 2007, where I saw young people stand with immigrants, a lot of people who were American citizens, protect us, defend us against Islamophobia. And I didn't know what socialism really was, but I would be intrigued. Why do these people talk about Muslims' rights when they're not Muslims, or Mexicans' rights, or immigrants' rights when they're not Mexican? And it didn't make sense to me initially. And, one comrade who's now a comrade said, well, we're socialists. I was like, what does that mean? Well, that means we stand for humanity, we stand for human dignity, for equality, for justice. And I was like, well, that sounds like a very good idea. Maybe I want to be a socialist too. And that's how it all began. And then I got involved in the anti-war movement. Back then, there was the Iraq War. And now, of course, we're in an era of endless wars and genocide. So that's how my politicization began. And I came back to Pakistan. I was active in some farmers' movement, these peasants who were resisting their evictions from their lands by the military. This was, again, pressure from Gulf countries back then who wanted to use those lands for corporate farming. And I saw what big corporate capital does to people, how it destroys their livelihoods. And eventually, once I finished my PhD and I moved to Pakistan, I was teaching and I was raising these issues publicly. And that's when I was removed from teaching in 2018. I was banned, and later a sedition case was launched against me, which carries a life sentence. And I'm still facing that here in Pakistan. So that kind of, in a way, meant that politics is not something you can ignore when politics chooses you. And that's when we moved towards the People's Rights Party, the Haqooq-e-Khalq Party, HKP. And it really stemmed out of these different social movements that were trying to fight back, including students, including trade unions, including farmers. And we still think it's very much a transitionary phase in our efforts to build or rebuild a large left-wing socialist political force in the country.
Wow, that's an amazing, I'd say life story, background. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Now, you are the first guest that we've had on Global Majority for Peace to talk about Pakistan. So I'd love for you to situate for us the position of Pakistan in the shifting geopolitical landscape. So let's start with the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir that erupted on May 7th earlier this year. The initiating trigger was said to be the terror attack in Pahalgam, carried out by Kashmiri militants in late April, in which 26 tourists were killed. India accused Pakistan of being behind these attacks, which then led to a 4-day military conflict until a ceasefire was announced on May 10th. If we go by the media's framing of this conflict, in broad strokes, India used Western-made military weapons and China provided J-10 fighter jets to Pakistan. This was reported as a success for Chinese military manufacturing and a disruption for the hegemony of the US military-industrial complex. I mean, depending on what media sources you were reading. It also suggested a clear alignment between Pakistan and China on one side and the US and India on the other side. But when we look further into the matter, a much more complicated picture emerges, as you understand, I think, very well. Can you help break this down for us?
Of course. So you rightly pointed out that Pahalgam was the trigger. But I must say here that no Kashmiri group, militant or otherwise, claimed responsibility. This was an accusation made by the Indian government. And later, without any kind of investigation, on the first day, in fact, the first hour after this incident, India started blaming Pakistan. So this is the beginning. There's, of course, a historical perspective to this. The fact that the people of Kashmir have not been given the right to self-determination. Both India and Pakistan are responsible for that, but the Indian side in particular is a military occupation of 800,000 soldiers that are on the ground. And you have almost 100,000 Kashmiris who have been martyred in the freedom struggle. So that injustice and occupation is at the heart of the crisis in Kashmir. Now, after Pahalgam, if one country says, there's an attack that's happened, the other country is responsible for that. The other country, Pakistan in this case, said that we're willing to cooperate. We're willing to investigate with you. We're even willing to bring this third party investigator, the UN or even the US, and ready to cooperate with them if you are able to provide any kinds of evidence that Pakistan was involved. But India was acting as the judge and jury, and of course, eventually the executioner. And India began this entire media blitz where they said, Pakistan is the heart and center of terror in the region. India, of course, is the beacon of democracy. It's the center of civilization. This framing is very much part of what Hindutva, which is the right-wing Hindu movement, which is in power right now, led by Narendra Modi, utilizes every time it wants to shore up its base, its electoral base. Hating Pakistan is very much a political act now in India. And they accuse Pakistan of being in cahoots with the terrorists, and eventually not only accused Pakistan, but suspended the Indus Water Treaty, which is a water treaty between India and Pakistan since the 1960s. That's how we share our water. And India, basically, in an act of collective punishment, just unilaterally withdrew from the treaty. Then the Indian media and high officials started talking about how they want to reduce Pakistan to Gaza, how they want to reduce Pakistan to Afghanistan. The language was genocidal. It was manic, hysterical. And to be honest, considering that Pakistan historically has not been able to match Indian military might, we all were extremely nervous. We all were peaceniks. We all wanted peace. Anybody in their right mind would want peace between two nuclear powers. But the constituency for peace in India is gone. That's what we were realizing in those few days. And when eventually India crossed the line and began attacking us with drones, which included Israeli manufactured drones and French fighter jets, Rafales, which are kind of like the linchpin of the Western defense industry right now. Many of us thought that we will be reduced to this kind of territory with a foreign power acquiring monopoly over our skies, so a territory that is constantly punished. We all are watching the genocide. We all are watching what Israel is not just doing in Gaza, but also what it did in Lebanon and Israel and the whole region. They're pride bombing the whole region. And you have these government ministers in India saying we need to do the same to Pakistan. And we, to the surprise of not only Pakistanis, but to the surprise of the world, I think, Pakistan, which had Chinese J-10 and J-15 fighter jets, flew them, fought with the Indians, and eventually, now the world knows, we downed about 5 French fighter jets that were being flown by the Indian Air Force. So the Pakistan Air Force was able to actually inflict a historic defeat. India initially refused to acknowledge those jets that it had lost, but the shares of the Chinese defense industry just skyrocketed, because the world knew that this is a world historical moment in some ways. I mean, war is, of course, a terrible thing. But you see, for third world countries, one of the biggest problems has been the quest for technology. And the reason why we've been colonized, we've been brutalized, is because the West has had the monopoly over technology, and India had the best Western technology. And we were relying on regional technology, on Chinese technology. What this battle showed is that China has decisively overcome the technological gap in the defense industry. It has broken the monopoly of the French in the skies. Now, this is not to say that China has reached the levels of the US. Of course, China is not investing all its resources and making its own people homeless to build its military industrial complex. However, it does show that now there is very real competition, and you cannot disregard the East anymore when it comes to military, which would be a situation, an unprecedented situation in the past 300 years. That, I think, is the historic significance of this battle. And within 3 days, India and Pakistan both agreed to ceasefire. I tell you, India was not in the mood for a ceasefire in 3 days. They wanted to go on and on. And right now, the Indian Prime Minister is being grilled in the parliament by the opposition, saying, why did you start this if you wanted to finish it in 3 days? What have you achieved? You've not killed one terrorist. You've not destroyed one base. You've not destroyed any of the capacities of Pakistan. And now you're also being accused of submitting to Trump's whims. When he said you do a ceasefire, you accepted it. So it's a shock to India. It's a shock to the Western defense industry. But I think it's a net gain for the Chinese defense industry. It does, of course, create problems for Pakistan internally. The problem is that the military, which historically has monopolized power, becomes even more popular. And that is a problem. But I'd rather have that and fight that internally than allow a foreign power to have monopolies over our skies.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. But why do you think Trump supposedly brokered this peace treaty? And why did India agree?
Well, India agreed because India realized that it could not have this monopoly that it thought it did. They really thought that the imbalance, the military imbalance was so great that they could continue fighting for a very long time. And, once you have monopoly of the sky, over the skies, then you can destroy the bases and the main military capacities and eventually then go inside the territory whenever you want. So that basically would have meant that we would have been in a situation of permanent threat from India. I think that equilibrium was built in those 3 days because of Chinese technology. For one, Trump has eyes on both India and Pakistan when it comes to acquiring the market. Pakistan is in a very interesting situation right now because historically we've been a proxy of the US. We've been a frontline state for the US, and the US is trying very hard to intervene again through the IMF, through the World Bank, also through this massive minerals deal that was ongoing in March, April, when the war broke out. These are critical minerals that will be very important in the new Cold War. So Trump has a stake in Pakistan. He has a stake in India. And his ideal situation would be that both these governments, even if they hate each other, they remain within the ambit of the Western sphere and do not move towards China. I mean, India has no chance of moving towards China immediately, although they are in BRICS. But Pakistan is vacillating, and that's a problem.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, just to expand a little bit more on this. So, in the 50s, as you mentioned, Pakistan was a frontline state for the US-led anti-communist Cold War. And many viewed Imran Khan's rise as a signal of a shift towards greater sovereignty through deeper ties with China and a rhetoric of non-alignment. Following his ousting in 2022, he has since been sentenced to 14 years in prison, events widely seen as orchestrated by US-aligned factions. Now, as you were saying, Pakistan's in a very changeable position right now. Can you break down the political shifts from that period? I mean, we could be here for 10 hours if you did the whole history.
Yeah, I'll have my coffee. And
but sort of from that shift, whether you agree with that analysis and what the current position of sovereignty and anti-imperialism is in Pakistan today.
Yeah, no, so let's start with the past. 1950s is a decisive moment for Pakistan when Pakistan decides, and there are tensions within the Pakistan movement and the military. There's even a coup attempt by leftist officers, similar to what happened in Egypt and elsewhere, where leftist officers overthrew the government, and all of that fails. Eventually, the ruling elites feel that the only way they can fight the leftist threat is by being firmly anchored in the Western camp. And that's pretty much what happens when we sign the Seto-Cento Pacts, these two defense pacts that were signed in 1953 and 54, which put Pakistan firmly in the defense sphere of the West. And this is the height of the Cold War. Stalin is still alive. Asia, there's the Korean War happening. Things are heating up in Vietnam, in China, elsewhere. So Pakistan has chosen a side in the 50s. And over time, Pakistan remains in the Western camp in the 60s. There's a break in the 70s with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who moves partly towards China, and I'll come to China, Pakistan in a second, partly towards China, partly towards the Muslim world. He organizes the Islamic Summit Conference in 1974, where he takes a very bold position for the Palestinians and against Israel and criticizes the US. His government, as I said, was overthrown in 1977 and he was hanged in 1979. And then Pakistan has been, once again, a frontline state since the 80s. Now, two things complicate this narrative. The first is that despite being a frontline state for the US, Pakistan developed very good relations with China early on. This is early 1960s. Now, this is an interesting time period when the Sino-Soviet split is happening. So China is moving away from the Soviet Union. Pakistan's main problem was with the Soviet Union because Pakistan felt that the Soviet Union was supporting elements in Pakistan that were separatists, that wanted the dismemberment of Pakistan. This was the official Soviet communist line. When the Sino-Soviet split happened and it became clear that China would have no interest in breaking up any countries, there was this softness towards China. Another incident happened, which is the India-China war that happened around the same time. So 62. India was very firmly in the Soviet camp. And in this fight, China chose Pakistan or Pakistan chose China because the Indian threat was the primary kind of psychological and ideological problem for the Pakistani state. So here you have a country that is breaking from the Soviet Union. It's breaking from India. So why not be friends with that country? The only problem was the US. So Pakistan was still a friend with the US. And Pakistan was able to maneuver this relationship between the US and China. By the late 60s, Pakistan mastered it. How? Pakistan actually facilitated the beginning of relations between China and the US. So Henry Kissinger was famously flown from Pakistan to China on a secret mission before Nixon went to Beijing. So Pakistan was the mediator between the two countries. And that has been Pakistan's role for the last 50, 55 years. It's more so firmly in the Western camp, but it also has very good relations with China. The other thing that complicates this narrative is that Pakistan has had difficult relations with the US since the war on terror. So this tension is not new. This tension has been there since the drone strikes began, which was not something that most people in the military hierarchy or in the political setup agreed to. And Pakistan was, if you remember, increasingly accused of playing a double game, of taking money from the US to support the war on terror against the Taliban, while also protecting the Taliban. The most famous incident, of course, is the raid to kill Osama bin Laden. The whole war on terror was fought to catch Osama bin Laden and kill him. And the country that was a frontline state is where he was basically kind of in like government protection. So this tension was very much at the heart of the US-Pakistan relations because Pakistan, despite being very close to the US, the Pakistani leadership had lost confidence in the US since the Afghan Jihad, because after supporting terror groups in Pakistan in the 1980s against Afghanistan, the US just abandoned Pakistan, forgot about Pakistan. And in the 90s, we had to deal with rising extremism. So there was that kind of grudge, if you will, that existed. On the other hand, China was about to launch the BRI, and Pakistan became a central conduit for that. And we'll discuss that in greater detail. So at the same time, while we were with the US and NATO, and we were the conduit for NATO supplies to Afghanistan, we also became the conduit for Chinese goods and BRI and CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So we'll discuss that more in a bit. Now, to bring that to the political figures that you mentioned, including Imran Khan. So in Pakistan, the foreign policy is very much dictated by what we call the establishment, which basically is a euphemism for the military. The military is the one that has dealt with foreign powers over the past 70 years, particularly since the Seto-Cento Pacts. And that's the dominant element. And the tensions between Pakistan and the US that predated Khan's rise were basically tensions between the military and Pentagon, the Pakistani military and the Pentagon. And if you look at any kind of political leader, even before him, they would kind of toe the line that the military would take. So, for example, the CPEC, this BRI, arrived under the predecessor of Imran Khan, Nawaz Sharif. He was the one who went to Beijing and was supporting CPEC. There was an Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, which the party prior to that, the People's Party was bringing from Tehran, actually during the reign of Ahmadinejad, who came to Pakistan. So these alternatives were being explored. All of these prime ministers, presidents were eventually overthrown. Now, my position in that is they were not overthrown because of foreign policy issues primarily. They were overthrown because of internal political intrigues. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, that's the closest you can come to some kind of foreign conspiracy. But even there, it was primarily an internal issue where the military kind of colluded with the counter-revolutionaries to overthrow him. Then Nawaz Sharif the former prime minister, has been overthrown twice and arrested by the military. Actually, he was in prison when Imran Khan won the election. So he wasn't even allowed to campaign against Imran Khan. And then Imran Khan had a falling out with the military in 2021-22 over the appointment of the next head of the ISI and the chief of army staff. So basically, he had a falling out, which became very public. It was end of 2021. Before that, the relations were excellent between the two. The 2018 elections were widely believed to be rigged in his favor. And it's the military that rigs elections. This time they rigged them against him. He won these elections last year. So this keeps happening in our history. He, like all major politicians in Pakistan, dislikes the US. See, in Pakistan, nobody can say the US has our interests at heart. The relationship with the US is a very cynical one, which says, okay, if we don't go with them, they might put sanctions on us or bomb us or those kinds of things, doomsday scenarios. Not that, this is the free world and we want that nonsense doesn't exist in Pakistan. He wanted to take on the IMF, but for example, very early on, he was forced to give up his finance minister. And he put in a finance minister who had worked for the World Bank, Hafiz Sheikh, and later another finance minister who had worked for the IMF. He then pushed a bill in the parliament that freed the central bank, the State Bank of Pakistan, which basically is, again, a euphemism for this neoliberal kind of wage-suppressing economics, and put in charge this former IMF boss in General Sisi's Egypt, Raza Bakir. And I used to write about these things back then, on how all of this was panning out. So he was not kind of very confrontational with the US. He was also very close to Trump. He had very good relations with Trump, not so close with Biden, because Biden had a policy of punishing Pakistan, and that's an older kind of history. However, there were no sanctions imposed on us. There was no kind of military coup. So that kind of a regime change that comes to mind when you think about Lumumba or Allende or Sukarno or any of those, that did not happen. He had a falling out with his generals who overthrew him. And basically through a vote of no confidence, the political support that was given to him was withdrawn by these parties. And since then, he's been incredibly popular because he went on the offensive. He's taken back internally, I don't know if the global left is following that, but internally he's taken back the narrative that America is the primary enemy, because right now many of his party members are lobbying in Washington to get him freed. So there's that side of Khan, but he remains a very popular figure, not because of the US or anti-US sentiment, which is of course there, but because there's a huge resentment against the military for stealing the mandate again and again, for rigging elections again and again, for jailing prime ministers again and again. And I think if there were any free and fair elections in Pakistan, 4 years ago, he would have lost them. Right now, he will get a supermajority, and that is why they're not holding free and fair elections.
Interesting. Okay, so just a quick question before we go on to the next question. So this assertion that the Pakistan military is more aligned with the US, in your opinion, is not valid?
Not anymore. No. See, Pakistan is, in that sense, a split personality. 80% of our defense equipment is now coming from China. 80%. We are split in the sense that our financial dependence is still on the IMF. Our military dependence is on China. Now, this is not a conscious effort on the part of our leaders that we want to be close to China. It's just a practical thing. India is attacking us. We don't have weapons. America doesn't trust us. We don't trust them. China is like, hello, friend, here are the toys. Go and fight. So, so it's a practical, pragmatic kind of a move to be with China. But financially, we cannot even formulate our budget without IMF officials sitting through it, approving this much budget for education, this much for health, cut this, increase this tax, decrease that tax, privatize this, nationalize, like everything is to the details. It's gross, it's sickening the way the IMF deals with Pakistan. It's one of those basket cases of, Argentina, Pakistan, a few other countries are like that, where we're in this debt trap. So that is the reason why we don't have sovereign development. You cannot be sovereign just on the basis of your military. You also need an economic sovereign policy. You need a foreign policy that's sovereign. You need a social policy that's sovereign. And none of that is true for Pakistan, unfortunately.
Yeah, let's unpack a little bit. For those people who might not know about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or rather, they might actually believe what is on the IMF's website, which is their expressed purpose, and this is a direct quote from their website, is that it works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all of its 191 member countries. But as you said, it's really more of an economic coercion. I've heard you actually say that half of Pakistan's annual national budget goes to repaying IMF loans. So can you just unpack a little bit more about what the implications are for that, for Pakistan?
Well, Pakistan in the 1950s, 60s, basically our elites decided that we don't need any kind of serious reforms, no land reforms like China, no industrial policy in any serious way, nothing productive. We had a base in the 1950s, 60s, where it was basically turned into these big monopoly capitalists and landlords who took over. And there was no innovation. Basically, they were running on state supports, but this was like socialism for the rich. You had the state, but this was the state basically keeping these few robber barons rich. This was kind of the structure we inherited from the East India Company, where the state was very much there, but it was used to accumulate capital rather than redistribute wealth or to improve the productive capacity of the subcontinent. What that meant was that the only way you could continue living elite lifestyles, remember, Pakistani elites and their lifestyles are comparable to global elites. You go to Dubai, go to England, I'm sure you've met Pakistanis from Pakistan. The investments in the housing markets are massive, in Dubai in particular, but also in London, Paris, elsewhere. Now, how is this lifestyle maintained? It's all on borrowed money. It's from the IMF, it's from the World Bank, it's from all kinds of international financial institutions. All of this money is spent on these luxuries, not on actually producing productive capital, improving the productive base of the country, giving jobs to ordinary people, utilizing their potential. No, none of that. This just goes into real estate, goes into all these big cartels that we have here, goes into stocks, the military is a massive player in our economic life, goes to the military, but it doesn't really translate into something productive. Now, when it comes to repaying those loans, you've kind of spent all that money. So how will you repay? The IMF has its list, which is basically cut the health budget, cut the education budget, privatize banks, privatize other institutions, including transport, including steel mill, all kinds of other entities need to be privatized. Then, if you can't put tax on the rich, increase the tax on everything that common people use, increase tax on like basic commodities, and the subsidies for energy, and the subsidies for health. And eventually, it's the poor who are about, right now, we've reached 45% poverty. They are sacrificing the future of their children. They can't send their children to school. They're sacrificing the health of their elders. They can't pay for healthcare. They're doing all of that to repay the loans taken by our elites. This is almost like neo-feudal kind of a way of running an economy. And it's very extractive. And 46% of our budget this time was used to repaying loans. And there's no product, you're not using any products in England, Pakistani products. We're not producing anything, we're consuming. It's not the ordinary people, not the 45% who live below poverty line, who are basically malnourished. They're not consuming anything. It's some people who are consuming, and their consumptive lifestyles cannot continue without these loans. And the IMF knows that. And the IMF uses this weakness of our ruling classes for geostrategic purposes of the Pentagon. And this is where, people like Michael Hudson and others have talked about the link between the IMF and World Bank. Every time there's a war in the region, the IMF gets active. And they're like, we're ready to roll over your loans. We're ready to help you. We're ready to facilitate more aid. Just, talk to the US. And what's the talk with the US? Give us air bases. Go into a war that will kill 70,000 Pakistanis. That's how many Pakistanis who got killed in the war on terror. Or jump into this Afghan jihad that will turn your country into this hub of religious extremism. Do that. Destroy your future. And as long as you do that, we'll just like loosen the leash a little. That's all that it is. And it is economic warfare. It's geopolitical warfare. It is extraction of the labor of the poorest Pakistanis to facilitate global capital and our elites, and to further the geostrategic interests of the US.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really brilliant breakdown. Thank you for that. I mean, often we tend to think of China and the Belt and Road Initiative as a viable alternative, but let's unpack that, because Pakistan did enter into the China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2015. And certainly the BRI does not have interventionist methods of the IMF. However, one of the misleading criticisms of the BRI is often perpetuated in the West, is that it has similarly extractive and exploitative characteristics. However, I think we really need to break that down a little bit more, because the BRI is a no strings attached development model, which means that the terms of the infrastructure projects varies widely from country to country, largely due to domestic conditions not set by China. And so whether or not it can actually offer Pakistan the alternative that it needs for its development and progress, you've described Pakistan as a rentier state addicted to proxy wars and short-term super exploitation, which you actually did sort of go over just before in your previous answer. So the question is, like, how much can the BRI really help Pakistan with its development and progress?
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the first part, we've never heard even the name of the Chinese finance minister. We've not heard the name of any of the major actors, their individual names, who are giving Pakistan loans, who are helping set up these investments in the energy sector, in our railway system, in our roads, in our ports, because China does not kind of dictate. Whereas the IMF, head of IMF or chief guy in Pakistan, people know who he is or she is, because they literally sit in Islamabad and read the entire budget before it's approved and tell them this, you can do this, you can't do this. Neoliberalism, that's what will save you. Free market, that will save you. China doesn't say free market or socialism will save you. China basically does a pragmatic kind of exchange, which is that, if you need this infrastructure, we have the money to invest in it. And what that does for China is that it connects China to the markets as this giant of an economy that it's turning into. It wants access to resources. It wants this connectivity that can be what in the Chinese words, the phrase that they use is a win-win situation. So a win-win situation for both countries. Now, there are two issues. Just to tell you this Western propaganda about BRI, just on that, to give you one stark example. It started, so CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is the Pakistani version of BRI, or the Pakistan side of the BRI. This was launched in 2014-15. While this was happening, Pakistan was still a frontline state in NATO's war on terror. And our ports and our roads were being used to supply NATO troops in Afghanistan. Like, commodities were flowing. And when the Chinese started coming in, they were coming in to invest in the energy crisis, massive, massive energy crisis. You might see during this session, the power, a few years ago, the power would have gone every 10 minutes. I mean, that's how bad it was. China invested massively in the energy sector. It's improved, significantly now. Then you had these railroads, these roads that were built. And there were plans to build 42 industrial zones. These were the kinds of discussions. The discussions with NATO was, these many weapons are passing through Pakistan. The Taliban have attacked the NATO supply routes. The US has droned this area of Pakistan. So America was using Pakistan as a dumping site for war. America was basically selling us a vision of ruins, a planet of ruins. And that's consistent with what it's done in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and of course, most spectacularly in Gaza with the genocide. But with Pakistan, they did something similar. So this is basically death and destruction that the US was offering. And on the other side, you had China coming in with all this kind of hopeful narrative of development, of progress, of investments in energy sector, in transport, in connectivity. So it was a very, very different experience. There was a lot of support for CPEC initially, and China did a very interesting thing that it not only spoke to the government, it also spoke to the opposition. It also spoke to religious groups, dissident groups, all kinds of people were invited to Beijing at that time. This is 2015, 2016. But China cannot, or any country cannot develop another country. This has to be an internal will. You have to create an internal will, and more than even an internal will, you have to create the class coalition that is interested in productive sectors rather than in extractive sectors. If you have a class coalition led by the military generals here in Pakistan, which is all about rent-seeking and proxy wars, then you can have BRI, or you can even have the angels come in to help you, and they will fail too. And that's what happened. The first problem that the state used was that they stopped China from speaking to anyone on the ground or any opposition figure. So they wanted to monopolize CPEC. This is, of course, the military. Then there was fight between Nawaz Sharif, who was the prime minister then, and the military generals over who will head the CPEC authority. Sharif wanted the civilians, and the military, of course, wanted it for themselves. Both, in a way, were hoping for rent-seeking, in my opinion, although Nawaz Sharif, probably the civilians would have had to do more because there's more transparency involved when the parliament is involved. But they wanted to use all these major contracts that were coming to make quick money, rather than thinking about the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. One example is when they were building those roads to connect to the port, the idea was, well, you'll have these roads connecting different parts of Pakistan to China and to the port of Gwadar, and they'll develop the port in Gwadar. There'll be 52 industrial zones that will be built. Those industries will be supplied the energy by these new kind of investments in energy, which included coal, but also wind, solar, all kinds of different investments. And that's how you'll have growth in the Pakistani economy for the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And what our leadership was doing was that instead of responding to that, they were trying to buy the land around those roads before they were announced, so you could get it for real cheap. And once those roads are announced, their prices would go up 20 times, 30 times. That's casino capitalism. That's speculation of the worst kind. And these are insiders, big economists. One of them was Kaisa Bengali, who was in the negotiations, who later was a whistleblower and said, this is what was happening. We were negotiating with the Chinese and we were negotiating over terms. And someone would say, no, this has to be announced next week. Whatever the Chinese are saying, just go ahead with it, accept it. There's no pressure from China. This is Dr. Bengali's statement. No pressure from China, just pressure from our people, because they had already made the investments on land. So they were not interested in industrial development. They were not interested in exports or any kind of long-term perspective. They were interested in making millions and billions within few weeks and months, and then leave Pakistan after retirement. And that's what a lot of our capitalist class does. They make money, they invest it abroad, and they leave. It's very consistent with the Lebanese ruling elites or, many of these other Middle Eastern, Asian elites. And they're not sincere. So what can the Chinese do in that situation? So we botched it up. Then when Imran Khan came to power, his finance minister gave an interview. His name was Razak Daud. And he gave an interview to the Financial Times saying, we will investigate all the contracts, the Chinese CPEC contracts, because they were under pressure from the IMF to make all the contracts transparent. And that also pissed off the Chinese. So basically CPEC kind of stalled. And in the last 6 months or a year, it is restarting. The Iranian president recently visited Pakistan. Afghanistan has joined BRI. So there's again some activity that's happening. But I think in the long run, we cannot achieve any kind of benefits from any deal without a coalition within Pakistan that seeks development, that seeks the uplift of its own people, that wants to take people, Pakistani people, out of poverty, that's invested in the hopes and aspirations of the people of Pakistan, rather than the property markets in the Gulf or in the West. And I think that is one of the reasons why CPEC which still has a lot of potential, it did not really realize its potential. I'll just add one thing, if I may. There was also another problem that CPEC mapped onto, which was a security issue in Balochistan. Now, Balochistan is this restive province where there's been a historic claim that we are a separate country. Balochistan exists both in Pakistan, but also in Iran. And there's this historical tension, which is very normal for post-colonial states. But you have to integrate people by giving them rights. But the Pakistani state, since the 40s, 50s, used the military language or the armed option as the primary vehicle to subdue the Baloch. And that caused more and more and more resentment. Now, Balochistan is a key nodal point of the CPEC project because Gwadar, which is where the port was supposed to be built, which is functional but not realizing its potential, that passes through Balochistan, and Gwadar is in Balochistan. And the Baloch were very upset with the Pakistani government for basically ignoring them. And when the Chinese tried reaching out to the Baloch, the Pakistani government intervened and said, no, you can only speak to the military. What's happened over the last few years is that the Baloch militants started gravitating towards the US. There's a very good article that just came out in Al Jazeera with this Palestinian writer talked about how Israel was trying to use the Baloch cause as well. So India, Israel, America used genuine discontent of the Baloch to redirect it or redivert it towards the Chinese. So Chinese teachers have been killed. Confucius centers in Karachi have been attacked. Chinese engineers have been killed. And, they say it's Chinese imperialism that we're fighting. I've not seen an imperialism whose primary faces are engineers and teachers and doctors. It's a warped kind of a situation where America is trying to use these cleavages to further destabilize the region. But the primary responsibility will always remain with the Pakistani state, that they have to include the people, including those on the peripheries, so that hostile powers, and I consider the US a hostile power, they should not be able to take advantage of this situation. And our Chinese friends also feel protected and welcomed in Pakistan because a vast majority of people welcome China's investments.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's horrible. But also, it's just the reality of most countries really dealing with trying to develop and progress. They're dealing with these external factors. Now, I'd like to get your analysis on this because, like you said, Pakistan is shifting, vacillating between the US and China for many different reasons. India was huge allies with Russia, also vacillating maybe more between Russia and US. But now, in recent months, we've seen this renewed chatter around the possible resurgence of the RIC, Russia, India, China troika. In your opinion, what do you think of the significance of this? And do you think this means anything about regional sovereignty and the broader struggle against US hegemony?
You see, things are changing so fast on the ground. A week ago, India was firmly in the American camp. And then Trump was extremely rude and basically also slapped 25% tariffs on India because of its relations with Russia. So there's that problem. Iran, which historically has had better relations with India, no longer trusts India as much. And the Iranian president was in Pakistan because Pakistan openly supported Iran in its conflict with Israel and the US. This is a very, very interesting world that, I mean, very scary as well, but also interesting because there are no certainties, there are no finalities. Even the actors involved, when you talk to people in foreign policy circles here, for example, they're not fully sure what they're doing. The pace of events has exceeded any kind of theoretical framework that we had, any kind of analysis that people could do. It's too fast. Everything and everyone and every actor is vacillating so much. Pakistan's vacillation, I've already explained, it's between this necessity to protect itself and this need of the elites to make cheap dollars. This kind of vacillation will keep happening, and that's the reason why one day we're celebrating Chinese technology, how it defended us, protected us. Next day, we are going to the IMF and producing a terrible budget. And then the day after, we're supporting Iran's resistance against Israel. And then the day after, we are nominating Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's like everybody's hedging their bets on everyone. And this is, a moment of, as Chairman Mao used to say, a moment of great opportunities and great dangers. There's dangers, of course. The danger for a country like Pakistan is that in its mind, we're playing this very dangerous game where we think we can fool two superpowers. It's kind of like an ant trying to really think that it's at the center of two elephants. And that would cause a lot of damage. On the other hand, there's a very real opportunity to develop a sovereign project in Pakistan, to develop a project that doesn't really necessarily say we're going to be at war with the West, but says, we have to prioritize our relations in the region, focus on regional development, and make the people of Pakistan the priority. The pivot should be around the people of Pakistan. On the other hand, every country is in a similar flux. Again, 2 weeks ago, India had no idea that the US could turn into an adversary, or at least, a country that is creating obstacles. In American-Indian friendship for the last 15 years has been touted as one which, has this huge potential for the future. And now it's an obstacle. And that's because of these historic relations with Russia and India's needs, just the needs of the Indian economy, which is to get cheap oil. So there's now tension. Similarly with Iran, Iran is improving relations with Pakistan, which then means, it'll have to consider its relations with India. But if India and Russia keep breaking from the US, then, there is a very real possibility that a regional kind of solution might be sought, and that would be the ideal. One thing that it reflects decisively is that the US empire is declining. These are all symptoms of the decline of the US empire. That we still do not have the language or the theoretical framework on how to operate when you don't have this hegemonic country that monopolized the lives of the vast majority of the people on the planet. This is a sun that is setting. And now everybody is kind of trying to be very pragmatic, practical, but you have all these different kinds of fluxes because there's a vacuum that's been created. You don't have the global institutional architecture. You don't have the kind of bonds in the global south that should have existed. All of this is being built. We're in a very creative process. That's the opportunity part of the moment. With the decline of the US and its inability to impose any discipline on Ukraine, subjugate Russia. One day, Trump is with Russia. The other day he's with Ukraine. One day he's with India. One day he's against them. One day he's with, they're always with Israel, but, sometimes he just expresses frustration with Israel. Basically, they're frustrated. They're frustrated because they cannot impose their will. DC and the bureaucrats in DC are so used to imposing their will on the rest of the world. It's not happening. And every country can see they can get away with a lot. Pakistan would not have done this with Iran. I mean, would not have invited the Iranian president a month after they fired at American bases 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This was unthinkable. But now, they don't even care because they've realized America is no longer that kind of power. So we're in a creative moment where we need to create new institutions, new ways of thinking, and of course, new political parties. You have a new political party in your country, and all over the world, new political forces will emerge because I think we're in a new phase where, again, we don't have the language or the organizations or the institutions, but everybody can feel that the old world is dead. And this could be a time of monsters. As Gramsci famously said, the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. And in the middle, we have monsters. But it could also be the time for beautiful things. And I think certain bonds that are being built, relations, opportunities, visions, I think they represent a pivot towards the East after 400 years. And that's something that ought to be celebrated.
Yeah, really well said. I mean, I personally do think we've already seen the monsters. We see the monster's face. It's been pretty consistent for past few hundred years. But speaking of new political parties and opportunities, you said in the beginning of this interview something that really stuck in my mind that, in 2018, you got fired as a teacher and then faced sedition charges for bringing up, politically pertinent issues. And you are one of the founders, I should say, of the People's Rights Party, which we introduced you as, which has since evolved to become a registered political party in 2022. So I think we have a sense of the opportunities that this People's Rights Party offers Pakistan from what you've been saying in this interview. But can you actually talk a little bit about the alternative that it presents for people and also what has been the public reception?
Well, we are starting with the tradition that is of the left in Pakistan that is glorious but very weak. Glorious in the sense that the party was banned in 1954, the Communist Party. And since then, the left existed in the underground. It received its major expression in the party created by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who, as I said, was martyred. And since then, that party kind of also deviated from any kind of a leftist agenda. So by the time we entered politics, we didn't have a massive memory of the left. We were very much in the middle of an ongoing counter-revolution. And what passed for the left in Pakistan were basically some kinds of liberal human rights activism, which is, of course, important in a country like Pakistan. However, you scratch them a little and you'll find a Democrat in the American sense, the Democratic Party. These were people who were, working with NED and all these other organizations. And that's the milieu in which, we were also operating, these human rights kinds of activists. And to break from that and go towards mass organizing, to go towards a position that is staunchly anti-imperialist, that's pro-China, that's rooted in the tradition of the global south, was for us very thrilling, but it's also something that's new. But, we have a lot of young people who are following our campaigns. Actually, the movement was born in the midst of a student movement in 2019, when, thousands of students, many of whom were part of our organization, They organized countrywide demonstrations to demand the restoration of the student union. Student unions were banned in the 1980s, they're still banned, but that movement kind of captured the public's imagination. And since then, we've been building cadres across the country, trade union movements, farmers' movements. We're also very clear that we're a transitionary party in the sense that we're working with other groups with similar agendas of rebuilding the left. We have two very good friends who are very active in another part of Pakistan. You might have heard of them, Fatima Bhutto and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Jr., who come from the left wing of the Bhutto legacy. Fatima Bhutto, of course, she's a very vocal kind of a supporter of Palestine on social media. And they are also entering politics, and we are in talks with them to consolidate our work and perhaps even move towards a united left party. All of this is extremely exciting because none of this has happened in years. Left-wing organizing at this scale amongst students, amongst workers, amongst farmers. We're in the middle of a farmers' campaign against corporate farming. Again, this is something that is being pushed by the Gulf states. And there's an ongoing campaign for that. So we are very much in the process of rebuilding the infrastructure that's required for long-term battle. I don't think that left-wing movements should go towards the route of that kind of populism where you immediately have some stars who win, but you don't have the infrastructure. You never built that kind of infrastructure. So we were courted by a lot of mainstream parties and politicians, join the Senate through us or come to Parliament through us. But then that would have just meant me as an individual going somewhere. I'm very bored with that. In any case, I don't feel like I'm missing out not being in the Parliament. I would rather put my energies with all my other comrades in building the grassroots infrastructures. The only way we'll have a viable left is when we have a viable labor movement, a viable farmers movement, a viable women's movement, a viable ecology movement. Those movements are the only basis for some kind of a sustained left-wing project. And that's where we're at. And we're going to contest, if this United Left Party moves ahead, we're very hopeful that it will. I think we'll have a very good chance to, from right now, where the left has never been seen in even the top 15, 20 parties of the country, I think we will be in the top 5 parties very soon. And that will be a seismic shift in Pakistan's politics. And it would be good because we will be bringing back the socialist agenda of using the state not to enrich the few, but to actually help the many, to nationalize our financial sector, to nationalize some of the key industries, including public transport and heavy machinery, to orient our country towards development and speculation, to push for regional integration, including closer ties with China, Russia, Iran, other countries. That is a project that no political party is interested in. Once we have a political project that is clear about the destiny of this region and Pakistan's place in that destiny, which is away from Western domination, which is anchored in the histories and hopes and aspirations of our own people, our own region, our own civilizations, I think that party will be the kind of rupture that the people have been waiting for. And that is what we want to dedicate our lives into building.
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, I definitely wish you well. I think you have an optimistic future. That's what I hope from what you're saying. And
thank you.
I wish we had someone like you here in the UK.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy you're there. You're holding the fort.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Global Majority for Peace, Ammar. An absolute pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And everyone, thank you for watching. We are actually going to take a few weeks break, but we're going to unlock a lot of full episodes for you, just to prove that we're not capitalists. And but we'll see you in September. So thank you so much. Bye.